Hey historians, this is an overview of government in ancient Rome. During this video, please take notes on the most important ideas in your history notebook or on a blank Google Doc if you don't have your history notebook at home. So here we go. The history of ancient Rome spans from roughly the years 800 BCE to about 500 CE, so about 1,300 years in total. And there are four major kind of periods of time we're going to focus on. You can see the four different colors that represent them. So first of all, we have early Rome from roughly 800 BCE to 509 BCE. And during this time, there was a small village settlement in around 753 BCE by a Latin tribe, and that village was later taken over by the Etruscans in 616 BCE. We'll hear more about that later, and slowly this village would grow into a large city. The next major period of time was the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic lasted from 509 BCE to 49 BCE. They were able to overthrow the Etruscans and create a republic. There were two major social classes, and they were very strict social classes. You could not move between them. There was the patricians and the plebeians, which made up most of the population. And we would see an imbalance in power between these two groups for over 200 years. During the Roman Republic, Rome also expanded significantly 3 times. After the Republic, Rome would become an empire in 44 BCE, and it would last until 500 CE. The Republic would collapse due to too much land under its control and too many wars being fought. There was a brief time where Julius Caesar was a dictator. Then later, Emperor Augustus helped Rome expand for the 4th time. Then this led to Pax Romana, a time of peace. During this time, Jesus was born and Christianity was started as a religion. However, later in the 400s CE, the empire would begin to weaken. The Western Empire eventually would fall. And then the Eastern Roman Empire would become what's called the Byzantine Empire, and it would actually survive the fall of the Western Empire and last until 1453 CE. So pretty long time span. But we're going to really focus on early Rome, the Roman Republic, and the Roman Empire. So early settlements in Rome. There's a very famous myth about two brothers named Romulus and Remus. The myth says that their uncle, a king, was afraid that they would steal his throne since they were the sons of the god Mars. So he had the two boys sentenced to be drowned in the river. But according to the myth, a she-wolf rescued them and raised them. And then the two brothers decided to start a settlement. They disagreed over where to start it. So Romulus and Remus fought. And Romulus would win and kill his brother, and he named his city after him. And that is the myth of how Rome began. Now, actually, how Rome began is more about looking at the early Romans and their neighbors. So as you can see here on the map, we have a small Greek section labeled Latium, and that's where the Latins had settled. They were a group that had settled in Italy before the 1000s BCE. And around 700 BCE, they would form this city on what's now called Palatine Hill. You also see the orange on the map called Etruria, and the Etruscans were from Etruria. They were a tribe that came to Italy in the 800s, and they were able to conquer all of this land, including the city of Rome, by 600 BCE. And you also see purple, which are Greek trading colonies that we've talked about before. And so Rome was heavily influenced by their neighbors, the Etruscans and the Greeks. This would influence their culture quite a bit. That's one of the big takeaways from this slide. Rome was influenced by Greek and Etruscan culture. Moving on, we're going to focus on the rise of the Roman Republic. So as I said before, there were patricians, the upper class people, and the plebeians, the lower class people, the workers. And there was a strict social divide. You could not marry outside of your class. You could not gain enough money to become a patrician. It was very rigid. Now in 509 BCE, the patricians, the wealthy people, decided they were tired of Etruscan rule and they rebelled. They were able to overthrow the Etruscans, and instead of establishing a new monarchy, they decided to establish a republic. And a republic is a form of government in which leaders are elected to represent the people. Now, in this earliest republic, the people really meant just the patricians. So they formed these different groups in their republic. First, they had the Senate, 300 patricians who were elected by other patricians to govern, and they would serve for the remainder of their life. They would elect 2 consuls or 2 chief leaders who had control of the army. Now, the Senate had most of the governing power, including passing the laws, and the laws were not actually written down, so the patricians could kind of bend the laws to suit their needs. So, as a result, this small group of wealthy families had all of the political power in Rome, and over time, the plebeians would be tired of being governed by a system in which they had absolutely no power. So, this conflict is called the conflict of the orders, the disagreement between the patricians and the plebeians. And the plebeians were upset because they had to follow these laws even though they had no way to help influence them. And whenever Rome went to war to try and increase their territory or fight off an invasion, wars would add to the tension between the two because the plebeians were the soldiers. They had to go fight and risk their lives in war, but the patricians were the ones that declared war in the first place. So by 494 BCE, the plebeians come together and they actually march out of the city of Rome. And they camp out on a hill nearby and they refuse to return to the city of Rome until their demands to be part of the government were met. So with the plebeians gone, that meant there was no workforce in Rome, there was no one farming, there was no army to protect them. So very quickly, the plebeians realized they had to come back and compromise with the patricians. So, in order to get their city back in order, the patricians had to compromise with the plebeians. So now we see a shift towards a more equal republic. The plebeians could now elect officials, and these officials were in the tribunes of the plebs. The tribunes spoke for the plebeians in the Senate and with the consuls. So the plebeians couldn't yet be in the Senate or be a consul, but they at least had a voice and could advocate for themselves. Later, the tribunes could actually veto Senate actions if the plebeians were unhappy with them. And later, the plebeians could elect officials into the council of the plebs, which meant they could now make their own laws, but they still couldn't make laws the patricians had to follow. Now, this was better, but it still wasn't fully equal. So over the next 200 years, the plebeians would make further demands to make the republic more equal. So we see that in 451 BCE, they were able to finally have the laws written down so they would be more consistent. Then by 367, there was a new law that said one of the consuls, one of the top people in the government, must be a plebeian. So there was one patrician consul and one plebeian consul, and this meant plebeians could now join the Senate as well. And by 287 BCE, plebeians had the right to pass laws for all Roman citizens. They were able to form a citizens' association, which was male adult citizens that had the power to approve or reject laws. They could also nominate people to serve in the government. And finally, they had a constitution, a basic set of laws that everyone agreed to follow. So here we have a diagram that shows how plebeians and patricians could move between the different levels of government. So finally, after over 200 years, we have a more equal republic. It is important to notice that yes, there was equality for the male adult citizens of Rome, but still not for the women. I mean, come on. Now we move into a period of the Roman expansion. So Rome, we know, became a very large empire, but that didn't happen all at once. So there was the first period of expansion from roughly 509 to 264 BCE. And within this period of expansion, ancient Rome fought with their neighbors, the Etruscans. They allied with the Latins, the tribe to the south. They were almost wiped out by the Gauls, a northern tribe. Their city was burned to the ground, but they decided to rebuild, and they were able to recover and able to reconquer a lot of land around them. And again, this is a span of almost 200 years, so this wasn't happening overnight. There were unequal rights for different citizens that were in the conquered territory, and they did tax their allies, so they were trying to keep people in control. And eventually, Rome was able to take over the entire Italian peninsula, this boot-shaped purple area here. Then we move into the second period of expansion, about 100-ish years. During this time, Rome was really focused on fighting against Carthage, which is a city here in the northern part of Africa, and they were a very powerful city-state. They controlled all the trade in the Mediterranean. They had a lot of territory, and Rome decided to go to war against them. So their first war, the Punic War, was mostly fought at sea. And at first, it was going really well for the Carthaginians, but Rome actually copied a lot of their naval strategies and was able to win. So later, the leader of Carthage, Hannibal, tried to march his army to Rome to fight a second Punic War. It lasted about 15 years, but then the Romans sent a second army to actually attack Carthage, and Hannibal had to return home to try and defend his city. They lost, and Rome fully conquered Carthage, and this led to about 50 years of peace. Then, a Roman senator really decided that Carthage had been terrible to Rome and they needed to destroy it, so Rome actually burned Carthage to the ground in the Third Punic War, and Carthage would not be a major power again. And so Rome was able to conquer all the land that you see here in green after the Punic Wars. Finally, we move into the third period of expansion, 145 to 44 BCE, so about 100 years. So what would happen in this time is the territory would continue to expand. You can see that it stretches all the way around the Mediterranean, even as far north up to this area here called Gaul, which is modern-day France. And what would happen is they had a lot of land, but the Republic wasn't really made to help control this much territory and this many citizens. So the Republic would eventually collapse under the strain of this new empire. What helped it along was that there were many rebellions from people who were conquered by Rome and weren't happy about it. There was slave revolts. There was wide unemployment. So the people were pretty unhappy at this point. And so what that meant was Rome was fighting a lot of wars, and the generals who led the legions of soldiers were gaining a lot of power since they were helping Rome. These generals were gaining influence by continuing to conquer, so they would conquer lands, and then that would give them wealth and influence. And this would lead to two generals and one politician. So Crassus was a politician, and Pompey and Caesar were generals, and they would actually come together through some political maneuvering to be what's called the first triumvirate. So now instead of a republic with the consuls and the Senate, we have three consuls kind of leading Rome, and the Senate is more of a figurehead. They don't really have any power. And Caesar would eventually become dictator for life. So by the end of the third period of expansion, the republic has fallen, and we have a dictator rising to power. Now, Caesar's rule didn't last for very long, and it would lead into the fourth period of expansion, 44 BCE to 14 CE, and this is where Rome emerges as an empire instead of a republic. So after Caesar was assassinated, his grandnephew Octavian became the sole ruler of Rome. He actually was renamed Caesar Augustus, and he became the emperor, the first emperor of Rome. So he expanded Rome's territory even further. He passed many new reforms and laws that led to stability, and this would lead to what's known as the Pax Romana, a time period of peace that lasted from 27 BCE to 180 CE. So during this time, the Roman Empire is able to keep expanding and to keep putting policies and infrastructure in place that keeps their empire strong and stable. This is the end of this video focused on the early republic and how it fell. In our next video, we'll focus more on the Roman Empire and how that would affect the politics of Rome.